Hello and welcome back to part 2 of the lecture on rewriting. In this section I want to think again about writing back, and I want to move forward to thinking about the individual biographies of the authors and what each of them has brought to Hamlet in this case. Writing back is an interesting term in itself. It comes from post-colonial criticism, and this is where I think the lecture starts to think about issues of identity politics. The post-colonial area of criticism is usually one where we think about different kinds of identity, geographical, racial, ethnic, cultural, and so on. So the idea of writing back as coming from post-colonial criticism is interesting because it makes the idea of writing back get immediately mixed up with the idea of identity politics. It's kind of hard to separate the two once you've thought about them as writing back. It's best known from Salman Rushdie's 1982 article, The Empire Writes Back with a Vengeance. This is where the term is coined, so it's Rushdie's term for what he and others are doing when, as he puts it, they write back to imperial texts. And in 1989, there's a famous work of literary criticism by Bill Ashcroft, Gareth Griffiths and Helen Tiffin, which is called The Empire Writes Back. And of course the whole thing is a Star Wars joke as well. We're talking about the Empire writing back because we're thinking about the Empire striking back. So right away you've got these kind of pop cultural, quite jolly references to the idea of empire and subversion, to the idea of a rebel alliance attacking an almighty and in this case evil empire. And it's meant to appeal to a wider audience, this term, I think, than those who would normally think about post-colonial criticism. It's a kind of pop post-colonial term that people can easily start to identify with. And when they read a book which might be described as writing back, and perhaps start to think about some of those post-colonial ideas. Writing back is a problematic term in some ways, though. The way that Rushdie and Ashcroft and Griffiths and Tiffin thought about it is that it's an initially responsive mode of literature. So it responds to something. It has a kicking off point. It has a starting point, which is with an existing original work of literature. That means it's very much in the mode of answering. So think about the ways that I described the idea of rewriting in part 1 of the lecture. The idea of writing back positions the rewriting fairly firmly as an answer to something else. But also it's a very strongly subversive term. That backness is important. So yes, it's an answer, but it's also kind of snapping back, fighting back, answering back. And that gives it a certain kind of cultural energy, which can seem subversive and can seem almost hostile from the initial viewpoint of the reader. And I think that's interesting. Not all writers are comfortable with that notion. Some are, some aren't. Some see it as an inherent part of their practice, others don't. What it does is to reinsert voices into the literature as a form of colonial nations, thereby creating a new text. So a good example would be Jean Rhys's book, Wide Sargasso Sea, for example, which writes back to Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. And it does that by focusing on one of the marginalised characters in Jane Eyre, the mad woman in the attic, as she's often described. Bertha Mason, Bertha Rochester, Bertha, whoever she was before she became Mr. Rochester's wife and was subsequently, spoiler alert, shut up in the attic of his house. And it rewrites that story in a very sympathetic way. It looks at her identity. It goes back to the place that she's imagined as coming from in the Caribbean. It thinks about the trials and tribulations that she encountered there and what might have driven her to become the character that she is in Jane Eyre. So it gives a backstory, it reinserts a voice, it reinserts a story. It allows us to listen to somebody who in the first text, the original text, Jane Eyre, is silenced, demonised, described as mad, and literally shut away in a part of the house that the text is narrating the story of, literally shut away in a part of the text too, therefore. So that is what writing back is, and it's a term that's extensively used throughout the period from really the 1980s onwards. There are some problems with it though, as I've been starting to sketch out. Not everybody feels comfortable with it. So for example, we've got a discussion of writing back here, which I think you might find interesting and useful. In traditional post-colonial theory, post-colonial literatures are characterised with an inevitable tendency towards a subversion of the West, these authors state. The dominant notion that post-colonial literature writes back to the Western metropolis has been criticised by authors and scholars from the global South, since it is questionable to suggest that Anglophone literatures are inevitably characterised by a post-colonial rewriting of Western master texts. These are ideas by Evan Mwangi being quoted by these authors. In their opinion, this concept should be overthrown because it reduces post-colonial writers to writing back to the centre. And think about the resonances of that phrase. Yeah, writing back, okay, we've examined that, but to the centre? That is a problem, isn't it? So who is central and who is peripheral? If you write back, are you not perpetuating that hierarchy of importance? Is that not a difficult and problematic thing? So it reduces post-colonial writers to writing back to the centre and reinforces and reinstates the West in being the main centre. Furthermore, it is problematic to present literatures from Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, etc. as dominantly an anti-art in relation to European literature. So the idea of antiness, the idea of writing back to something artful, can be problematic, can potentially be reductive or restrictive. Because on the one hand, it creates the notion of this literature as being primarily hostile, reactive and resentful. And there's that concern about that attitude coming across very strongly in this piece. On the other hand, it reinforces the idea that post-colonial literatures are exclusively concerned with colonial history and its political consequences. Doesn't that tend to recapitulate the idea of colonial power? Doesn't it trap writers in a particular subject position? Is that something that everybody is going to be comfortable with? So it reinforces these kind of older ideas. Literatures from the global South, the writers continue, demand to be viewed as positive self-affirmations that are not blind to internal causes of problems within their own societies. They do not want to be perceived as only writing back to the Western metropolis, but also as writing back to themselves in order to address their own issues. In this perspective, post-colonial literatures have proliferated into a plethora of topics and genres and have thus inscribed themselves into the corpora of an emergent world literature. That's a really interesting discussion, isn't it? It tries to move away from some of the binaries of writing and writing back, or colonial and post-colonial, to think about ways in which post-colonial literatures might actually be trapped by a feeling of having to react against something, of having to be always subversive, having to be always hostile, of having to adopt a certain position with regard to something else which is regarded as the centre. Instead, how about literatures of the global South particularly, but also global literature more generally, writing back to themselves, having a dialogue with themselves? You know, texts are in dialogue amongst themselves in any case. It's one of the themes of this module, isn't it? The way that texts write back to each other. What if some of those texts are not from outside of a particular society or writing tradition, but what if they are all from within it? So the idea of writing back can be problematic, and some writers see it as a position in which not all rewriters want to be trapped. The idea of world literature, with which that quotation ends, is pretty important here too, as well, I think. The idea of world literature does contain within it some of the terms that we've been thinking about, the idea of empire, colonial cultures and diaspora. But those ideas also bring together and, to some extent, unite all four writers that we're looking at this week. And I want to start thinking about that now. Who are those writers in individual detail? What are their biographies? Some of the things you might or might not have noticed about them are, for example, that Atwood is Canadian. And if you think about it, Canada, although now an independent country, is a former British dominion. Stoppard is a Czech-British writer, and when he left the area that is now the Czech Republic in Eastern Europe, this was part of the former Austro-Hungarian Empire. So a completely different empire, and one that we don't talk about a lot these days, unless we're talking about the origins of the First World War, which is probably where you might have encountered it. The Czech lands were obviously annexed also by Nazi Germany in 1938. So He comes from a place which has been multiply occupied, has been highly contentious in at least 2 world wars and a number of important regional conflicts as well. And when Stoppard's family, and we'll talk about this in part 3 of the lecture, flee the now Czech Republic, they come to Britain via India, which at the time was under direct rule by a British Governor-General, and then they move on to Singapore, which was also under direct rule, but under a completely different name, the Straits Settlements. The idea of settlement is really quite interesting there, I think. Stoppard spends a lot of time thinking about words in this way. Mullen, meanwhile, is an African-American writer, and her identity, of course, brings with it notions of enslaved African forebears, and also the notion of hyphenated Americans, I think. So the idea that an American citizen must have a prefix to their American identity, Hungarian American or German American or African American. America is also, of course, composed in part of former British colonies, the 13 colonies along the east coast. So it too is a colonial power and stole the land of those who originally occupied it. McEwan, finally, is one of the writers who is perhaps closest to the idea of the centre of the British Empire, if we want to think about it in those historic terms. He comes from a British military family posted to Singapore and Libya, former Italian colonies, and West Germany, which of course is a former colonial power in its own right, but was then subsequently, after the Second World War, invaded, colonised, divided in 1945 and has now reunited. There's some really complicated, interesting political histories behind all of these people, and they are aware of those and they write about those in their work. McEwan's name is also Scottish, of course, and I think it's interesting to think, particularly now at the moment, of the ways in which Scottishness is not Britishness. It's not quite the same thing, and many Scottish people are uncomfortable with being described as British because they feel it essentially equates to English. So think about who each of these writers are, how they describe themselves, what their names tell us about them. For exercise 2, I'd like you to follow this up in more detail. Look at a biography of each author. You can start with Wikipedia, that's completely fine. And think about who you think they are. What does that mean? Who are these people? What are some of the words you would use to describe them and to start to define their position as writers? Maybe pick 5 words for each one. Who would you think these rewriters, these writers are? And we'll examine that further in part 3 of the lecture.